You are now listening to an episode of the Hey Sis podcast. I am the
Hey
host, Dr.
everyone,
Dee Evans.
you're listening to the Hey Sis
Let's get
podcast
into
today,
it.
and I am your host, Dr. Dee Evans. I want to talk about mistakes we make with setting boundaries. Now, we do know that boundaries communicate how we want to be treated, and they make expectations clear so that both parties or all parties know what to expect from each other and honestly how they should behave. Now, if you've listened to any of my other podcast episodes on boundaries, you know that without boundaries, people can take advantage of you because you haven't set limits or communicated what behavior is okay and what isn't. And if you're anything like me, I've taken a lot of steps to create boundaries, not to control people, but to ensure that I have a better quality of life. I don't want to live a life that I feel like I want to escape from. I'm not talking about a utopian heaven on earth necessarily. But I am talking about making sure that I create a space in my life, in my home, where I love people well and respect their boundaries, and also that they respect mine too. But I've made some mistakes, and that's why I'm sharing 5 mistakes we all could be making when we set boundaries and how to fix them. So, the first mistake or common mistake we make when we set boundaries is that we're too focused on getting other people to change their behavior. Now, don't get me wrong, boundaries can definitely include a request for someone else to change, but boundaries are intended to help you meet your needs or help you, I guess, achieve a better quality of life, not change or control a person, and especially not manipulate a person. With boundaries, the only person you should be concerned about is you in a sense. So, for example, if you're dating your boyfriend and you're saying, "Hey, please stop texting me at 1 a.m. I'm asleep." That's not a boundary. What you should say for a boundary is, "Hey, my phone is off from midnight to 5, so I'll text you after 5 a.m." That's a boundary. Does that make sense? When you set a boundary, make sure your effort is spent identifying what you can change to meet your needs, not changing someone else. Does that make sense? And of course, if they love you, they'll respect your boundaries and prayerfully they'll accommodate it. But even if they don't, you set a boundary within yourself. So if Bae keeps texting you at 1 a.m., text away. I can't stop you. I don't control your fingers. You're not a remote control. But what I can do is say a boundary within myself. I'm not answering it until a certain time. Now, another common mistake you make when you're setting boundaries is that you set boundaries when you're angry. When you set boundaries in the heat of the moment, it just ends up being a form of punishment or an ultimatum. If you get in an argument with your husband and you're like, "I'm going to file for divorce if you say that again," but you really don't have an intent to file a divorce, that's an ultimatum. That's a punishment, really, not a boundary. Again, boundaries aren't meant to punish. They're not meant to control someone, especially when you say things in the heat of a moment, right? And most importantly, ultimatums and punishments are not effective boundaries. They're said in anger, which is a fleeting moment, and they escalate conflicts. And honestly, they aren't really effective in encouraging someone to change their behavior. So, unless you're in immediate danger, wait until you're calm to set a boundary. Wait until your journaling time to set a boundary. Wait until you've had time to reflect before you set boundaries. And this will help you avoid damaging relationships. If you love the person and you really want to maintain a relationship, take time to think, okay, how can I keep this person in my life and not feel like I'm being smothered or not feel like I'm being disrespected or feel like I'm being drained. Now, the third mistake we commonly make when setting boundaries is that we give in when there's pushback. Eek. We all know this. It's in my other podcast episodes on boundaries, guys. People may not respond kindly to your boundaries. Some people respond in anger, and some people may respond with trying to set their own sort of boundaries, but it's really an ultimatum or punishment for not giving them what they want. People will let you know directly or indirectly that they don't like your boundaries and they don't respect them. But newsflash, just because someone doesn't like your boundaries doesn't mean that you need to change them. I just had this happen just a few days ago. When I go out to minister, especially if there's like prophetic ministry done, I have to set boundaries with the leaders most of the time. When I'm through ministering and I'm in the back gathering my things with my team, that is not the moment to come up to me and ask me for a personal prophetic word. I understand that people are in need. I understand that people feel like they need to ask me what God says. But when I am delivering a word of the Lord, I'm going to release what he gives me. When I am finished, I have a boundary. I don't do that. And that's it. And some preachers and pastors and leaders don't like that. And they're going to have to be okay. So to enforce that boundary, again, I can't change pastors. I can't make them not ask me. And ultimately, they don't really understand why I have that boundary in place. They don't need to. I just need to make sure that I enforce it to make sure my quality of life is better. So I've done my part in ensuring that when I travel with my security or when I travel with my admins, that they're well aware of what my boundaries are and how to help me maintain that. Because I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just preserving me and my energy. Most people will adjust to your boundaries if you continue to set them consistently. But if you give in when someone questions your boundaries or they don't like it, it's going to be hard. But what you need matters. What you need to function matters. What I've noticed I've given in to some boundaries at some points, which we'll talk about, because I can see a need and I choose to. But oftentimes when I don't give in, I feel baited at times, especially when it comes to church or church people. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm taking up your time. They're not really sorry. They're just trying to say that to segue into taking up more time. So I've learned that if I look at my phone and it's a certain amount of time and that day I'm really trying to unwind and think through my life, I'm just not going to answer. I can't control them calling. All I can control is my response. And this year I'm going to do better with that because I need space to process. And my alone time means more to me than whatever crisis they're in. I can't fully show up for anyone if I haven't truly processed my life the way that I like to process. And most of all, I don't process my life to be thrown into chaos with other people all the time. Hallelujah. Boundaries. High profile people, pastors, leaders that are listening, boundaries are important. Moving on, one of the fourth ways that we make boundary setting mistakes is that our boundaries are kind of overly rigid. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're dating and your bae says, look, I go to bed at 10, but this night you're having a tough night and you call him at 9:59 and he's like, look, I can't talk to you. I have to go to bed at 10. That's an example of a boundary just being overly rigid. Like, come on, we haven't talked all day. You can spare 10 minutes. You can spare 20 minutes. Okay. You may not be able to spare it every day, but some boundaries are meant to be bent and then readjusted. Now, deal breaker boundaries are boundaries that you put in place to protect your health or your safety. Like deal breaker boundaries, are or include not tolerating physical abuse or not tolerating infidelity or not tolerating someone cussing you out or anything, right? Those boundaries need to be rigid, but there are flexible boundaries, especially when it comes to romantic relationships. How you spend time with one another, where you spend time. Be flexible, but also negotiate with your partner. I think the key is to know when it makes sense to compromise or be flexible, or when to be unwavering with your boundaries. And it does take time and it takes practice. And guess what? It's worth it. It's worth it. The last boundary setting mistake I want to go over with you is when we over explain our boundaries. When it comes to explaining your boundaries, less is better, especially when you're talking to someone who is asking about your boundary because they want to violate it or resist it. Now, the only people who want to argue about your boundaries are people that want you to bend a bit. And this may include a person trying to prove your boundary as invalid or nonsensical or offer unwanted solutions to get you to change your boundaries, right? Like if you say, I'm not taking you to the airport at 2 a.m., period. They go, well, I can pay you $40 to do it. See, that's an attempt to get you to change your boundary. And your boundary may be, hey, I can't take you at 2 a.m. because I'm exhausted and I have to work all week and I just feel strange and blah, 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 all the stuff. But that person doesn't need to know all that. No is enough. Hey, I'm not taking you. Move on. Right? Um, Over explaining your boundaries is also recognizing that some boundaries don't need to be communicated in words at all. Ghosting is still appropriate. I know people think it's mean, but you can ghost people, especially when they harm your emotional space or your mental space. It's not my responsibility to explain to an abuser that I don't like the fact that they're abusing me. Most abusers know. I doubt, how old are we? We are elder millennials, okay? Abusers know they're abusing. It is not my job to explain to you how your abuse is affecting me. That's not the case. And that's not the case in most scenarios. Ghosting is always appropriate when you're under narcissistic abuse, when you're under verbal abuse, when you're under physical abuse, when you're being gaslit. Bye. Huh? Abusers know when they be abusing. However, verbal communication and explaining, I don't want to say explaining, but being open in communication, um, in my opinion, doesn't apply to abuse or sexual predators. Okay? Um, but if you do honor the person, you want to maintain a relationship, you should enforce boundaries, and you may need to just give a little bit about why you have that set in place. But just know some people may try to question it or they think you're irrational. But in my experience, when I explain my boundaries a bit, um, I've seen people try to adopt my boundaries just out of spite, and it never works. Because I'm not doing it to show off. I'm doing it because I want a better quality of life. So as you see, boundaries can be complex. They can be full of nuance, right? But it's worth it. It's worth the complexity. It's worth the nuance. It's worth the freedom that you get with loving your life and the people in it and being loved well. It's so worth it. So what I want you to do is tell me your feedback on this. If you haven't went to the deevans.com yet, go there, drop a comment, look at some old podcast episodes if you're scrolling through Apple Podcast. I would love to hear your feedback. I would love to see you leave a review, 5 stars, please. Let the people know what you get from this podcast. Let me know what you get from the podcast, right? And listen, stay safe out there. It's 2025. We're going to have a good year, y'all. We're going to have an amazing year. And listen, join the Hey Sis Premium. It's no commercials. I'm very unhinged. with my bonus episodes. But like I said, 2025, we just want to live a life we don't want to escape from. And I'm excited about digging in more with the community and growing together. That's all I got. I love y'all for real.
You have just finished an episode of the Hey Sis podcast. For more episodes, hit the subscribe button. Thank you for listening.